Morning, everybody. Crappy Mondays. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox, and today I'm joined by the Mirror's deputy political editor, Lizzy Buchan. Morning, Lizzy.
Morning.
This is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to campaign for justice by yourselves. So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a vote that ends today on whether GPs will work to rule for the first time since 1964 in a fight for extra funding. And more on that in a bit. But first, I want to take you back in time to yesterday when the Sunday Mirror published this story on retired RAF squadron leader Pete Peters as my story, so I can do that. And in turn, Pete, who's 92, wants to take you back another 70 years to 1954 in the Pacific, where the Americans were exploding a series of hydrogen bombs at the height of the Cold War. Now, Pete was one of a handful of men able to fly, and Britain was the only ally to possess a plane that was capable of going high enough to sample the massive mushroom clouds that the US were creating. Now, the Americans had passed laws forbidding any foreign involvement with their nuclear program over fears of Soviet spies, so it was in greatest secrecy they offered the British a deal. Use your planes to fly the clouds, and you can keep some of the samples to help with your own atomic efforts. Britain agreed, but that secrecy had some tragic consequences. Not only was one plane lost in the Pacific and never found, because no one wanted to say where they were or what they were doing, but Pete and his comrades have never been acknowledged as veterans of nuclear testing. And that means he was recently refused the Nuclear Test Medal, which was awarded last year to those who took part in the British tests on the grounds that what he did was not as important. And here's a brief clip of what he has to say about that.
We didn't know what to expect because it never had been done before. We all picked up massive doses of radiation, but it didn't really seem to be obvious and to affect us much, or so we thought. But subsequently, after all this was done, and I went on to do some of the British tests, etc., eventually, etc., I ended up with lung disease, and my lungs are still affected for other reasons, due to the RAF as well as this. So there we are. It all seemed to work out okay. It so happens that all the others involved in these antics have all died, all of them from cancer. I did have cancer, once retired, but I got over it, and I'm here still to tell the tale, and I am now the only one left.
How do you feel about having been given the...
We had to cut that clip in the middle, as you can see. Now, the reason that I think, as you may have noticed, Pete was a bit breathless and taking a lot of breaths in that was because he has this lung disease. And as he also said, almost as an afterthought, he's survived cancer. Lizzy, can you see the MOD's point here and why he might not, because it wasn't a British test, why he might not deserve a medal? I think that's a stupid question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you can understand why obviously they have to have certain rules around who gets a medal and why, just so that they can make decisions. But there are always ways for exceptions to be made. And I think in circumstances like this, even if it wasn't a British test, it does seem a bit, I don't know, I think the public will probably find that to be a bit unfair.
Yeah, and I think the scientists at the time would do as well. So one of the things we found, which is in the online version of the story, is that William Penny, who was the scientist in charge of the bomb, when those samples came back, said, well, this is brilliant. Now we are closer to a hydrogen bomb ourselves. Then 4 years later, that's exactly what we managed to explode. If it wasn't for the samples that Pete collected, we wouldn't have today's nuclear deterrent. It is as simple as that. It was incredibly important. And that secrecy wasn't, well, it was justified at the time, but not really anymore. Now, Pete is 92 now. He's the last survivor of these tests. As he says, all his mates have died from cancer. And funnily enough, because they're not considered British test veterans, their deaths are not in the official government studies of what those men have been dying from either. So they're not recognised in that way. And they find it very difficult getting pensions. So Pete's been compensated for his colon cancer by the Americans, but only for perforated eardrums by the British, something that happened at a different place and time. He just, descended too quickly, his ears burst. Medal's just a bit of tin, but that lack of recognition has really far-reaching effects, doesn't it, Lizzie? It matters on different levels.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's not only about sort of being honoured for your work in something that is of national significance, but if you have that recognition, it makes it easier, I think, for society to sort of give you the things that you're due. And yeah, I think it's sort of, a lot of politicians have recognised that this whole situation has been poorly handled, but no one seems to have really got to grips with it. And so, yeah, I think, this kind of campaigning just serves to keep it in the minds of the politicians that, these people are being sort of, ignored and also are very elderly, and the time for their recognition is running out.
That's what Pete says. He says he's pushing on. He's campaigning still at the age of 92. It's astonishing. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that this medal probably needs to be sorted out? Pete, I should say, did get the Air Force Cross. Very, very high honour for this thing that he did. The commanding officer got an OBE, but most of the people on this unit got nothing at all. As we heard, a crew went down on the Pacific, nothing at all for them. And what he's campaigning for is that everyone in that squadron, ground crew, air crew, everyone gets the nuclear test medal, because it means so much. It's not about having the honour, it's about having the recognition. Steve says those men were serving their country. They should be due the nuclear test medal. It seems very petty of the MOD not to award them it. I am obviously going to agree with you there, Steve. Now, very quickly, there is some very good news. Harpoon says it was a test to move us all forward. Give the good sir his wish. It's good news. Now, in opposition, the Labour Party was really clear. They wanted this whole medal process that we in the Mirror exposed as being corrupted by officials operating behind a sort of cloak of official secrecy to deny any honour to these men. They said they really wanted to review and fix that medal process. John Healey, who is now the Defence Secretary, twice asked in Parliament for the criteria to be widened to include Pete's squadron, as well as others who flew in French and Chinese nuclear tests in the 1970s. And veterans themselves asked for these guys to be included and were refused by the MOD. Basically, I think because, their attitude was, well, you've got the damn medal you get banging on about. You're not having the cherry on the top as well. Steve says it's really poor planning by the medals people. Nuclear radiation knows no nationality or boundary. If you served on any nuke test, having been ordered to by the British government or military, then you should qualify. Again, Steve, I am not going to disagree with you there. Now, last week, as a result of Pete's story, which I rang and told him about at the weekend, he was dead chuffed. Last week, sources close to the Defence Secretary said to me that there was going to be an official review of this. They are now going to look at this. The minister is leaning into this whole issue of nuclear veterans and wants to get a lot of things sorted on this particular issue. Now, Lizzie, is this proof maybe that if those at the top do take notice, because those at the bottom are agitating for recognition and stuff like that, change can happen, can't it? Meaningful change can maybe be in the post.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're in a position at the moment, obviously, the new Labour government has come in, And it's been such a long time since Labour is in power. They are able to look at things again in a way that previous governments, some of them may have wanted to, but weren't able to do so because of the legacy of their party and that sort of thing. So Labour have sort of got a bit of a clean slate on this. And so you'd hope that they would come in, see that mistakes have been made in the past and say, look, let's just act and deal with this now. And yeah, I think now is a moment on a number of issues where you'd hope that if people who've been campaigning for a long time for justice can hopefully get a hearing. It's
really interesting that you say that. So you think that perhaps the Conservative Party, on a host of different problems, because their political, what they have previously done is X, therefore they cannot now resile from it. They can't change it. It would be something that would give the other side something to criticise, even if, whether it's nuclear veterans or Hillsborough or Grenfell or building new hospitals, I don't know, anything. If it was something that people would back, that they change their minds, that they refuse to change their minds on things for political reasons because it would make them look bad, even though they'd be doing the right thing.
I think that can certainly feed into things. I think if there's enough public opinion in one direction, they will act regardless. I think you saw that with the post office scandal, that public opinion was so intense in one direction that the government will act because they know that they have to. But I think what I mean is it becomes complicated if you're implicated in a bad decision or somebody who you supported has, or that sort of thing. So I think you can see that not just in government, but in kind of a lot of public services, in the NHS, in police forces, that sort of thing, that people can kind of find it hard to look at a situation with clear eyes if they've been in it or involved in it somehow themselves. And so I think, you see there are examples of the previous Conservative government going against what other iterations of the party have done. But I think it's a little simpler for Labour in this moment. It won't always be simple, but for right now, when they're still really fresh, I think it's a little simpler for them to make some of these decisions.
Yeah, and then perhaps after, another election, say, if they get in again, then it's whether or not they start reversing things they did the first time round. And see that it starts getting a bit sticky, doesn't it? Well, we'll have to wait and see, won't we, what happens with Pete Peters and how quickly that review can go. He wants his medal for Remembrance Sunday, which is not very far away, especially when you think about how long it might take to get a medal minted and sorted and out to him. Keep an eye on the paper because we will have updates about Pete and his campaign and how that's going. Now, on to the main story of the day. And while most outlets today are going to be leading on Chancellor Rachel Reeves saying that there is a £20 billion black hole in the nation's finances and that she's closing down massive infrastructure projects left, right and centre to try and fill the gap. But there is something else brewing, which I think has the potential to be even more important. GPs have been voting on whether to take industrial action, and that vote closes today. Lizzy, can you take us through this one? What's going on exactly?
Yeah, so you've got two separate issues here. So the BMA, the British Medical Association, their GPs and their GP members have been voting on whether to take part in what is called work to rule, which is basically where somebody does the terms of their job and nothing else. So you work exactly your hours, you do no overtime, you do, in theory, what you should be doing, what you're paid to do. But in reality, if you're a GP, and this happens in a lot of fields, but the GPs say, they're working far beyond what they're paid to do, their hours are far too long, they're doing so much paperwork, they're doing all sorts of extra things that are making the job more and more impossible for people to manage. The vote is on this today, and obviously it's hugely significant because the GPs are, the front door of the NHS. They do the vast majority of NHS work. We all think about the NHS and you think about hospitals, but really it's your family doctor who you're going to see for most of the things that affect you, whether it's just, small ailments, repeat prescriptions, all sorts of things. So if the GP service isn't working, it creates problems throughout the whole system. And if GPs decide, okay, we're going to do this work to rule system, which I think means that GPs won't see more than 25 patients a day, which still sounds like quite a lot to me, but it means that people will have to, there'll be longer waits to see the GP, longer waits for referrals. It's going to create loads of issues. And I think, is probably the last thing that both, the government and also people waiting for NHS treatment need. But, the BMA say that the GP contract is broken, that GPs are badly paid, that the system it's hard for them to recruit. They're really struggling to keep people on because it's just such hard work and so miserable. So, yeah, that's the situation we're in at the moment, and is a really, really early headache for Wes Streeting, the new health secretary.
Yeah, she thinks so. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that GPs should be taking industrial action like this? They're not striking. They are, as Lizzy said, working to rule. Cherry Girl talks about 14 years of Conservative underfunding. It's not really the GP's fault. Do they have are they one of those services maybe that you think shouldn't be allowed to strike, which would mean guaranteeing certain privileges to them if you're gonna do that? Now, the thing is that the GPs, like Lizzy said, they're a filter, aren't they? They're the safety net through which filters everybody out. So if you because it hasn't been working very well recently, that's why A&E has been filling up, because you go to the GP and there aren't any appointments, or you can't get in, or the GP has been at the limit of how many patients they can see that day. And they're very, very quick now in some cases to send patients straight to A&E to get fixed, because they cannot take it on, because there's not very many of them. There's 2,000 GP practices have closed down, I think, in the past 14 years. And they're increasingly doing stuff online, which doesn't suit everybody. And because they're not filtering those patients as well as they should at the GP level, everyone ends up in A&E. A&E then ends up on its knees. You've then got bed blocking, you've got ambulances queuing up, you've got people who aren't able to get out and get home because the GP isn't able to help them come back into the community. It's very, very difficult. And if that filtering system isn't working properly, or if now the filtering system is going to work to rule, it's going to be mad. Jacqueline says, I can't remember what she said now. Literally, I was just about to read it out. I think GPs are getting stronger with dealing with stuff. I don't know if she's talking about dealing with industrial action, or if the GP system is getting a bit better. But this vote is happening. They obviously don't feel it's getting much better. I think at the moment, they're supposed, the work to rule is that they would see 25 patients a day, which is what they're supposed to do. That's the safety limits that have been set. More than that, they say, is not safe. You start making bad decisions. They've long been operating past 25 patients a day, though, haven't they, Lizzy? And it seems they need it, but they need this better financing. So they only get 30 pence a patient for each practice. Is that really right?
Yeah, I think, GPs do have a really tough time. It's a really stressful job, and the demand is enormous. As you say, the number of GP surgeries that have closed over the past 14 years means that demand is kind of rising massively, and each GP is having to take on more patients, which makes it more and more difficult. And obviously, I think one of the key things that they say is that they just have too much paperwork. They're trying to jump through too many hoops, and it's really hard for them to get people to take on the job, because why, if you're a young doctor, maybe you wouldn't think, oh, I want to do this, because it just looks like a really stressful and difficult role to play. So I think, that is part of the picture. And I do think the new Labour government, they've had meetings with the BMA. I do think they understand the challenge here. What's difficult for them is that there are so many issues in the NHS across the board. And it's not only the GPs that are sort of threatening to take industrial action. Obviously, the junior doctors have been in dispute with the government for several years. The new health secretary is desperately trying to resolve that. NHS waiting lists are massive, and that's one of the key priorities that they've got to resolve. So they're really juggling a lot of really complicated things that are all interacting with each other. But having the GPs on strike at the moment is probably the last thing they want.
Well, that's kind of the obvious question, isn't it? If this vote goes through for taking this industrial action, Wes Streeting, like you say, the new health sector, he's already in talks with junior doctors. What is it? It's a 35% pay demand, I think. Has he really got like the political or financial bandwidth to deal with GPs too? I mean, I'm just agog at the idea that he could be able to actually fix this, because it seems irreparably massive, doesn't it, almost?
Yeah, though I think that one of the things that's been quite interesting is, governing is about choices, right? And everybody will have looked at the papers and the BBC Today and all of that and seen the sort of dire warnings that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is saying that there's a huge black hole in the public finances and all of that sort of thing. And there's a lot of quite gloomy talk about big cuts and, how bad the inheritance was from the Conservative government. And the finances are in a really challenging space. But what's quite interesting is we're also due to get recommendations on public sector pay today or tomorrow, which, the public sector pay bodies are independent and they recommend how much people should get in terms of pay rises every year. So we're expecting, nurses, police officers, teachers. And Rachel Reeves was out the other weekend sort of saying, we understand that there's a lot of money to pay people more, but strike action also has a cost. So this government is looking at strike action and threats of this kind through the lens of the fact that, okay, yeah, it's expensive to give people above an inflation pay rise, but also pay has been squeezed for the last 14 years. And if we don't give people a proper pay rise, you're pushing families into greater hardship. And in reality, it then means you lose so much time in the NHS, you lose time in schools, all of that sort of thing, which also has both a financial and a cost in terms of like people's health, like education, growth, progress of the nation. So I think they are making a choice here. They are, and I think that Wes Streeting will probably choose slightly differently to how the most recent series of health secretaries have acted.
Yeah, probably for the reason that you mentioned last time, which is about the historical, what you've done politically over the time and what you can do really, and whether you can make a change at some point. Richard says A&E and pharmacists sit either side with GPs now. Pharmacists aren't exactly happy either. They're both sort of treated as part of the filtering system to get into hospitals with things. And it's kind of, I suppose that the question is, how can you possibly have a chancellor, even if she's making that argument that you mentioned about saying that strike action has a cost in itself, and that is more than whatever pay rise we're going to award people. How can you have a chancellor who's coming out, as she is today, saying we cannot afford to build a hospitals, plural, and yet we can afford billions, it would have to be, to pay doctors or nurses more money? Politically, that must be very difficult to find a way to sell that people are going to believe you. If their hospital's falling down, they need that, and they'll say, well, look, you found the magic money tree for junior doctors or GPs. Why can't you find it for the new hospital?
But then I wonder whether people will understand that you need staff in that hospital, if you see what I mean. I think that, what Rachel Reeves is trying to do here today is they're obviously trying to make the public understand that things are really difficult and also lay the ground for the difficult choices they're going to have to start making pretty soon. But what's interesting is that the stuff that they're talking about, the hospitals and all of that sort of thing, that was part of a new hospitals program that Boris Johnson promised back in, I think, 2019, which has been repeatedly delayed, over budget. Loads of them never really, quite a lot of the hospitals that were promised as new hospitals turned out to just be refurbs of old hospitals. Yeah. So I think they're trying to cut the cord on that project completely. And I think there's quite a few other, projects that they're just like, this is a white elephant, we need to get rid of this. But also in Labour's manifesto, they made the point, they talk about trying to shift the health service into sort of a neighbourhood care system, get people out of hospital. And people working in health often make that argument that being in hospital is bad for people. It's much better for people to get care in their neighbourhood, at home, from their local doctor, from their pharmacist, rather than send somebody who's elderly or has complex needs into a hospital where they're going to get sick. It often shows people deteriorate quite quickly in sort of emergency care. So I think this is part of a direction of travel. But obviously you're right that, maybe people will listen to this and hear not going to build any hospitals, so why would I believe that you care about the NHS? And that's a difficult line that they're going to have to tread.
Yeah, it's astonishing, isn't it, as well, that it's the hospitals that tend to kill you off. And what do you think, everybody? Do you think that they should be paying GPs more? Do you think that they can sell this somehow to you? How would you feel about it if your GP was working to rule and saying, well, I can't fit you in any time in the next month because I'm working to rule. We need more money if we want to see you. How's that going to go down with you, or any health news that you might have? Steve says many surgeries are underfunded and understaffed. Our local health centre is shutting on Fridays because they don't have enough staff to cover the summer holidays. This is one of the last question, I suppose, Lizzie. How are patients going to react to this? Because they've been very supportive of NHS strike action up till now, but that's because they've still had the GPs perhaps to rely on to some extent, as shonky as that service has been in some places. If you're going to start finding that, the money isn't there for some things and it is there for other things, and suddenly we've got a government now that's talking about making cuts in order to save money, which I'm sorry, sounds an awful lot like austerity. And we all know where austerity led to. It led to everything being potholed, didn't it? Every single public service is potholed. And if the solution to that is really more austerity, I can't see people buying that line from the government that we have to cut to save money, because we all know you need to invest if you want to save money really in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult. And one of the, Labour, the new government is in its honeymoon period at the moment. Everyone's giving them the benefit of the doubt, but they know that isn't going to last. The public finances, the state of public services, threats from abroad, at home, all of that it's very acute. And I think they're trying to get this done now. Because they know probably by September, the public are going to be like, okay, we've heard enough about the Conservatives and what they did. What are you going to do about it? We voted for you. So that's going to become increasingly challenging for them. And I think in terms of GPs, we did see quite remarkable support for particularly nurses, but ambulance drivers, all of that sort of thing, paramedics, during the kind of long wave of strikes we had after the pandemic. It was much higher than the last government expected it to be. I think they gambled that the public wouldn't wear it, and were kind of taken slightly by surprise with the level of support there. I think there is this legacy of the pandemic. People always respect public sector workers anyway, but I think that the bravery shown by people during COVID, most of us haven't forgotten that. So there is that feeling about, and I think GPs are included in that, particularly if you live in a town, in a small community where you probably know your GP very well. So if your GP is doing this and it's somebody you've known for a very long time, and they're the face of the NHS to you, that may mean that you have a little bit more sympathy because you understand their situation. But I also think that sympathy does only go so far when you're waiting, when you're not feeling well and you're waiting for help and you're desperately fed up. So I think we'll have to wait and see how this pans out, and also what work to rule really looks like in terms of, how much it affects patients.
Yeah, well, I suppose as well, whether the GPs vote for it, but it seems fairly likely they will. Now on Twitter, Dennis says, if GPs go on strike, how would anybody know the difference? Richard says, skilled people with a vocation in healthcare are rare and appreciation remains lacking. They may be relatively well paid, but we need them so much and they're disenfranchised. We've got this awful system as well where GPs are kind of like a private business, but they're doing a contract for the NHS, and it's just not functioning. Steve said GPs need fixing to take the burden off A&E. People just flood to A&E now when they can't get an appointment. Yes, a strike would make that worse, but maybe that's what it would take. I wonder how long any strike really would last if that does go ahead. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? But I suspect this is going to be bigger than what Rachel was talking about today, which is why I thought it was important for us to discuss it. Now, we have managed to find some good news for you, and here it is. If there is a theme about today's show, it's recognition, really, official acknowledgement of the job that you do. And on page 18 of today's Mirror is the result of that. The medals of a trumpeter who sounded the charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War in 1854 have gone up for auction and sold for a whacking £12,000. Now, it's not about the price or who made that money. Because of that sale, the Mirror today, and probably other newspapers as well, is retelling the story of the original owner. It's trumpet major Martin Landfried, and he blew the order for 600 men on horseback, armed only with swords, to charge the Russian guns in what was probably the most suicidal, pointless, brave, negligent, murderous order from top brass given to anyone in our nation's history, probably ever. Probably even including nuclear test veterans. Now, Martin was shot through the arm with a shot that also killed his horse. And because they got medals for this insane, fruitless exercise, there are viewers out there now, and there are readers of the paper today who will go out and Google it. Who'll go out and learn something about it. Oh, I didn't know that. And now I do know something. We're remembering it. We're remembering Martin. We're still learning lessons from what happened there. Lizzy, I mean, is this proof, do you think, that official recognition, whether it's what GPs are doing or what nuclear veterans did 70 years ago, when that official recognition comes, it can correct the historical record in a way? It can last for centuries, can't it? Have long-term effects that are only good.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think it helps us to individualize things. When you think about what happened on that day and in other kind of battles and all of that, it helps to remind you that these are real people and individuals who had their own lives and were impacted by this sort of thing. And I think it sort of humanizes it and helps us to learn the lessons that we need to take from these things, so that, you know, terrible decisions are hopefully not made again. And yeah, I think it's important to sort of, you know, break that down and to have that as legacy, because memories can be short sometimes. So it's always useful to have, and a lesson for everyone, I think.
Yeah, especially when it's, you know, obviously the people involved in that are all now long gone. But if you get people the right recognition at the right time, then it does have an impact many, many, many years after their death. At the moment, see this watch strap here, which is the colours of the nuclear test medal. I got it myself as a little present when we won that campaign. I've got more of the medal than the guy who actually flew through nuclear clouds. Now, if that's not wrong, I don't know what is. If you're watching, John Healy, please sort out Pete Peters' medal for him and his comrades. That would be dandy. Thank you very much, Lizzy, for taking us through all of this. Good luck, we're streeting with what's in your in tray. We will see you all again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. Until then, everybody, take care. Tatty bye.